We are excited to introduce our keynote speaker today. So, our keynote speaker, she has been tirelessly promoting the Korean culture in this wonderful newspaper called the Korean Quarterly. So this newspaper, we have some issues there for free on the side. Please take it. We hope that you subscribe as well. She has been, sometimes it takes somebody who appreciates a culture but has a very unique view to bring the best out of it. So Korean Quarterly is an amazing resource for Korean Americans like me. This is a really wonderful newspaper. They celebrated the going on 22nd year printing, 22 years. Her and her husband, Stephen, have adopted 2 Korean children. They have 3 children, and they're now adults. They've been to Korea. They actually have a Pungmul group themselves in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And Martha has been tirelessly a champion for Korean culture. So please, without further ado, big round of applause for Martha Vickery.
만나서 반갑습니다. 초대해 주셔서 감사합니다. Okay, I'm just going to dive in. I have some slides to show, and I'm doing that along with my speech. So this is a shot of our first issue in the fall of 1997 here. We were a small group in our community of adult Korean adoptees, adoptive families, and second and first generation people at Korean Presbyterian Church of Minnesota in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota at that time. And for some years we were involved in an outreach to adoptive families. This is way back in the early to mid 90s through our church, and around 5 years elapsed between when we were doing that outreach and when we started publishing Korean Quarterly. And of course, before that time, my husband and I were journalists, and we were talking to a lot of other writers and people who wanted to contribute. And that's why we first started talking about what a community newspaper could do for the Korean American community. In terms of the Sejong Cultural Society, I've been very honored to be on the planning committee for the writing competition. I was a judge one year. Very, very challenging job, by the way, for the essay contest. But most years I've been charged with finding screening judges, and these are people who are like getting MAs in English literature or creative writing, who are willing to take on like hundreds of essays and do a quick run through them over a weekend and put the acceptable ones in a pile and the other ones in another pile. That's also a very challenging job. So The Post is a film. It was my favorite movie last year. It was about how publisher Katharine Graham risked the family newspaper, the Washington Post at that time, to expose the Pentagon Papers. And this quotation was attributed to her husband, who's a famous publisher and writer, Phil Graham, who said, "Journalism is the first rough draft of history." I think that we've approached Korean Quarterly with a sense of history, and that we have an opportunity to write a first rough draft of Korean American history. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. This is our 20th anniversary issue cover. With graphics made from the the graphics are made from the covers of the issues from the last 20 years by a very clever graphic designer. And I borrowed Phil Graham's idea for a cover, but I did credit him, by the way, appropriately in my edit note. So who created Korean Quarterly? It was myself, my husband, and a group. They were from our church, but also from our Korean school that we were going to at that time, and friends in the community who I knew were writers. And during the long period of developing Korean Quarterly, we observed how the Korean community communicated. This may sound familiar to you. because we found that there were many different subcommunities, the ones that are named on our mission statement that we just showed, and they're divided by the generations, their upbringing, in the case of Korean adoptees, and to some extent by language. Our pastor at that time went to a Presbyterian Church Foundation and it was for startup projects of any kind, and he got us some startup money, and we got subscribers through a mailing, and even advertisers before we even had a newspaper. So it was a sign that there was some energy available for this project, right? This is a shot of our 5th anniversary. It's our board and contributors. I think what we said is, everybody who's contributed and who's on the board, please come up and have your picture taken, that kind of a picture. It pretty much represents the kind of mix we have among our contributors and our board today. And this is a pretty typical list on the masthead. This was the summer 2018 issue, the one that's over there. There are non-Korean contributors, of course, but many of the names that you see on there that are non-Korean names are actually Korean adoptees, right? Okay, so what you can do when you are an independent nonprofit press. So firstly, nobody pays you, so you don't have any money. You're also not beholden to anybody. So you have a lot of freedom, and we took advantage of that freedom. Zeroed in on our community. Pretty much we ignore the mainstream press. Teach about history. The question of why am I a Korean American and not Korean? Why did I grow up here? A lot of Korean adoptees and second generation people even are wondering about that question. And celebrate accomplishments, and we also show the community their mentors and their role models, and use biographical and personal stories to illustrate who Korean Americans are. Filling in the gaps. I think this is a really important concept. Korean Americans have all the media problems of all ethnic groups, right? They're not well represented in any field. So we're trying to make that happen. It leads to a general lack of recognition of Korean Americans and identity issues. So we always want to talk about identity. And we started, experimentally. We were very local at first, and gradually we branched out to a national and then a small international audience as well. Okay, I wanted to talk about this book. It was very influential to us at Korean Quarterly when it first came out. It's called Seeds from a Silent Tree. It came out in late 1997. When I first heard about it, I could not believe that it was the first ever anthology of this kind. I thought that Korean adoptees had been connected for a long time, because in Minnesota, it seems like that's true. We have a very close community there. But that was wrong. Of course, that would all change if you think about the era in the next 10 years after 1997, right? With the advent of internet and social media and everything that came from then on. At that time, if you think about back to the late 1990s, those of us who can do that, or even the mid-1990s, it was still an era where the World Wide Web was ramping up. And even if Korean adoptees knew that they were a big group, I think they did know they were a big group, but they didn't know who each other were or where they were. So that's why this first anthology of stories by Korean adoptees about their lives was so important. It included stories from people from across the country, and it went viral, actually, as viral as anything could go at that time. I don't think we even said viral back then, but. And this is another event I wanted to mention from that time. This is a story from 1999. And it happened after a national get-together of Korean adoptees called The Gathering. And The Gathering was organized by Holt International. That's the big adoption, international adoption agency. After this event, where people met in Washington, D.C. and saw each other face to face, Korean adoptees wanted to meet each other more, right? And they organized conferences and meetings and everything nationwide. Right now, there are numerous conferences of adoptees all over the country these days and internationally. At that time, there were none. So in 1997 and 98, the year Korean Quarterly started publishing, it was a watershed time for Korean adoptees and their stories. It was these kinds of accomplishments and milestones that really pushed us. So I wanted to say something about Hapa adoptees. This picture I took just a few weeks ago in Korea. It's a photo of some Hapa or biracial adoptees on their tour in Korea. Hapa adoptees are a recently emerging group. They're half Korean, they're older, most of them, and most were raised with not much connection to Korean culture at all. The birth mothers of these adoptees were Korean nationals, and the fathers were US soldiers stationed in Korea during the post-war era. A large number of this group are in their 50s and 60s. So one of the things they're uniting around recently is DNA matching, which is allowing them to find their birth family of their fathers, and every once in a while the birth family of their mothers too. This photo is from a ceremony in September we covered that was part of a specialized Korea tour for Hapa adoptees about their unique story. The camp towns that grew up around US Army bases. It took place in Paju, a city near the DMZ, at the opening of a park dedicated to the birth mothers who gave them up. And we're covering this in our upcoming issue. These folks were a really fun group to be around. They look a little bit somber and nervous in this. It's because it was quite an emotional thing at this park dedication. And also they were just about to go on stage to sing their song. I think they were nervous about that too. So yes, this is about the Olympics. Of course, the Olympics happened in Korea this year, and we went to that. Among other things, we were following the story of two Minnesota sisters who both played hockey in the Olympics in Pyeongchang. It's a story that could not have been more perfect for Korean Quarterly as a Korean adoptee story. Two small-town Minnesota sisters who are best friends, always played hockey together. One was recruited to Team USA, and the other to Team Korea, which was a combined North-South team, remember? And Team USA women won the gold medal. Team Korea women barely made a goal. I think they made one goal. They lost every game by a lot. But they were heroes in South Korea because they were part of the story of this year's Olympics as the Peace Olympics. So it was very, very important. The homecoming party was in the small suburb of Vadnais Heights, north of St. Paul, and I think every hockey kid in the whole area was there with an American flag when they came back. I wanted to talk about the second generation to some extent because they're a big part of our readership and also our contributors. The second generation is now in their mid-adulthood. Some of them are in their later adulthood. They have grown-up children. That generation is really changing. And they're taking on leadership and influencing our society in many ways. This is a picture of Chung-Rae Lee. He was an earlier second-generation writer. I started hearing about, right when we published something about his first book, Native Speaker, I remember at that time. But he wrote a novel about a divided family. It's called The Surrendered. And then he wrote something called Loft, which is completely non-Korean theme. So, you know, you don't, if you're a novelist, you don't have to write about your own ethnic story. And he doesn't always, but he was an important voice of the second generation. And then, you know, a later novelist, Min Jin Lee, I also interviewed her, and she's more recently on the scene with her novel Pachinko about Koreans in Japan, which was on the list of New York Times Best Book of 2017. Margaret Cho. I have many photos of the second generation because I've done a slideshow about the history of Korean America and other venues, but so I just picked some out. Second generation stand-up comedy, who knew, right? There's interestingly quite a few second generation comics. Margaret Cho was an earlier comic who saw the funny side of growing up in Korean America. She jokes a lot about things like being a comedian and not, you know, a doctor or a lawyer, jokes like that. And she is actually going to be in Chicago, I think in like 2 weeks. She's still doing the same, you know, sort of stuff. And then very important to being in Chicago is the influence of the National Korean American Service and Education Consortium, or NAKASEC. And, you know, that's the KRCC is an affiliate of that here in Chicago. It's been leading an immigration reform coalition for many years. The push for immigration reform started right here in this state and in this city with the DREAM Act. I think it was about 18 years ago, authored by Senator Dick Durbin. Another interesting emerging group is the Hapa second generation. We don't really know the demographics of this generation right now, but of course they're out there, right? This woman, her name is Mitra Jalali Nelson, is an up-and-coming local politician and just won a seat on the city council in St. Paul in mid-August in a special election. I'm writing a profile of her in this coming issue. Her mom is a Korean adoptee, and her dad is an immigrant from Iran. Interestingly, I just got a story pitch on Friday from someone who wants to write a story about a Hmong Korean artist in the Twin Cities. So I think that's another second generation, you know, biracial person as well. Of course, first generation, you know, our elder first generation are the founders of our community. In Minnesota, the first immigrants came in the late 50s, probably around the same era as Chicago. They're some of the most important leaders in our Korean community. And this photo is from a Chuseok celebration in the Korean Service Center, which has championed elders' rights in the community for 50 years or more. And in the background is our Samalnari group, Shinparam. We went to their Chuseok celebration. Most adoptees and, you know, some second generation don't hear stories of immigration history from the first generation. So first generation voices have always been extremely important to Korean Quarterly's content. And then we have adoptive families, like my family. That's another reader group that can include siblings and parents and spouses and children of adoptees. We couldn't take a formal portrait this summer. We were together for one day. One kid was coming back from Korea and one was leaving for Korea. So we just said, let's go out in the backyard and take this really quick. So that's my daughter Maddie, Steve, my daughter Maddie, me, and Emma, and Hanyong. Hanyong is now starting his MA degree at University of Washington in Seattle. So joint mission. I wanted to take some time, the rest of the time, to talk about Sejong Society vision, you know, how our two organizations are really similar, even though we're doing things in very different ways. Thinking back, I was really fascinated to hear about what Sejong Society wanted to do when I first interviewed Lucy Park back in, I think it might have been 2004. It might have been the beginning of 2005. I can't remember. She said that her daughter was involved in a music competition where the contestants performed music from China. And that was one of the triggers for Lucy to help her reflect on, why can't Korean Americans do this, right? There are a lot of ways our two organizations have many shared values, even if we're going about our activities in very different ways, and I wanted to give a little bit of time to that. So I thought of kind of 5 values: elevating the community and inclusivity, using topics of universal appeal, accessibility and reaching out, sometimes reaching out with some fun, and what I called making careful choices, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So elevating the community, when people are recognized by their own ethnic community for their hard work and talent, it really means something. Sejong Cultural Society has been great at that from the very beginning, and later in the writing and poetry aspects of the organization as well. Students and young adults really know their contribution is important. This photo is from Concordia Language Village's Korean language group, founded also in the late 90s in northern Minnesota. Like the Sejong Society, the Korean program at Concordia always recruited non-Koreans into their program. And their reasoning, which I found out from interviewing their dean, Korean language is not just for Koreans. People need to learn it because it is an important world language. That's Concordia Language Village's policy. And that really stuck with me, you know. An important world language. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. So, as part of Sejong Cultural Society's mission statement, they have this. They hope that Korea's history will be accessible to people of any ethnicity and nationality while being a unique part of the larger, more familiar with Western culture. In my opinion, this is the smartest thing Sejong Cultural Society could have done, setting up its organization. It sets the organization apart from many other ethnic organizations that state they're working for inclusivity, but not living up to it in their policies. Choosing material with universal appeal, that's another strength of Sejong Cultural Society. This legend of Shimcheong, which is one of the folk tales that kids get to write about, it's very alive in popular culture today. This illustration is from the manga version of the story. And then, interestingly, there's also a K-drama version of it, some kind of an adaptation called Legend of the Blue Sea. I haven't seen it yet. Now I'm kind of curious. Also, using Our Twisted Hero as one of the stories to choose from. Very clever choice. It's used in many high schools already as required reading. It has an important moral component. It talks about issues that teens can really relate to. And it's also been a popular movie, and that always helps. Of course, we just already talked about this tonight, there's so much fun stuff going on that Sejong Cultural Society is doing. It's worked hard to make Shijo poetry accessible to a wide audience and develop materials like Shijo teaching workshop, samples, and videos. It's a really great model for any organization that want to get teachers interested in a new thing. And that's difficult to do because teachers are challenged by all the materials they're required to teach these days. You know, it's hard to motivate them to do something extra. It's always a good sign when an organization doesn't take itself too seriously. So when I see that your organization had a performance of rap Shijo poetry, and coming up in November, a pansori performance along with a jazz saxophone jango duo, I know that you're using experimentation and fun. Just to say, other Asian American organizations are using Korean pop culture as an audience hook, right? Theater Mu, the Asian American theater troupe in the Twin Cities, has also run a comedy recently having to do with K-dramas. So, of course, we're reviewing that in the upcoming issue. How could we not, right? if they're doing it, why can't we do it? That all said, we know that there's a lot of stuff to choose from these days. With news and social media, there's a daily deluge of information coming at us, and it's overwhelming. After a while, it all sounds the same. You know, it sounds like the white noise of news coming into your computer and ears. But Korean Quarterly has 4 issues a year. Our editorial discernment, filtering through the noise and concentrating on analysis and features, and usually not news, is crucial to making it work. We have to figure out what the mainstream is not doing well. For example, in our international coverage this summer, we concentrated on reporting the peace process in Korea. The US media has been all about denuclearization and whether or not North Korea is performing certain steps towards denuclearization, right? That's pretty much all you hear right now. In South Korea, where we were twice this year, the emphasis is on the importance of the peace process. And it's about how both sides have to maintain a balance and observe a mutual agreement to achieve peace for the 2 Koreas. That's also an important point of view, too. There is a big contrast between how our 2 societies view this matter of peacemaking, for sure. This is a story I wrote about Sejong's Cultural Society back in 2005. Sejong's Cultural Society also has to produce inspiring and appropriate content in a very few events per year. Much thought and planning has to go into these few opportunities to increase awareness of Korean culture. However, this organization seems to have impeccable instincts about how to make music and literature relevant, inclusive, and accessible, and also fun. Your organization has had amazing progress and has a great future ahead. I think your namesake, King Sejong, who made literature available to all, would be very proud. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. If you could stay up there for a moment. Would anybody does anybody have questions for Martha? Yes. Oh, I guess the question is, what draws you to Korean culture?
Oh, I see. Well, at the time we started this newspaper, we belonged to a Korean church, and we were also going to a Korean school, and we knew a good segment of the Korean American community in our area. And so when we started talking about what can we do to enhance the communication of the Korean American community in this area, you know, our thoughts turned to the community needs a newspaper. We perceived that people weren't communicating and that some form of communication that would be a media would help a lot. And that was the basic impetus for our forming our organization.
Thank you, Martha. I guess we're going to watch a little bit of her group too.
Sorry, girl.
Thank you again. Let's give Martha another big round of applause. Thank you so much, Martha. And Stephen, too, thank you so much for your help, for your contribution to Korean culture. So that was a lovely presentation, very educational. Such a lovely reason to bring people together from the Midwest here in Chicago.